Here we are, my friends, part 5 on the coming of the kingdom. Today we're going to be doing a little summary, some extra points and stuff like that. So, first big point, the church is not the kingdom. The word church means called out ones. The word kingdom means reign. We'll talk about that more in a second. In the last 4 days, we have looked at every passage about the timing of the coming of the kingdom. Before we sum up the recent articles, though, we need to add some additional thoughts and talk about some implications. We need to define what the kingdom is. The coming of the kingdom is not what it seems, but it is the time when the saints would inherit it in its fullness. The kingdom has always existed. Some people equate the church with the kingdom, and while there is overlap, the two are not exactly the same. This conclusion comes from a misinterpretation of Matthew 16, 17, and 18, which says, I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. This passage does not teach that Jesus would build the kingdom like the church, but that he gave Peter the keys to the kingdom. One does not give someone keys to something that doesn't already exist. This is a transfer of authority, but we'll talk about that later. Peter is told that the keys will bind things that have already been bound and loose things that have already been loosed. Let me give you a little example of this. You might know those like gangster movies and stuff, where like there's a driver and the guy might do a bad job driving. So what does he do? The boss takes the keys from the one guy, tosses them to the other guy, right? Okay, let's keep going. The kingdom of God has always existed. The expression kingdom of God means the reign of God, and God has always reigned. However, God has manifested his reign in various ways and through different people. Notice the following passage from Matthew 21:43. Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing the fruit of it. Matthew 8:11 and 12. I say to you that many will come from the east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, but the sons of the kingdom will be cast out in outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So when the New Testament talks about the coming of the kingdom, it is speaking of transferring the kingdom from one group of people to another and transitioning the kingdom from one nature to another. Now is the kingdom in the New Testament past, present, or future? During this transition, the disciples of Christ spoke of the kingdom as being present, as something that was being received, and in the future tense, as we've seen. They have talked about the kingdom how they talked about the kingdom depended on the perspective that they took in that particular writing. For example, in Colossians 1:13 and Colossians 3:1 and following, Paul speaks about the kingdom and the resurrection as being a present but ongoing reality with an emphasis on the past. Whereas in 1 Corinthians 15, he speaks of both as being a future but ongoing reality with an emphasis on the future. Now, once the church possessed the kingdom arrived. This language isn't foreign to us. When watching sports, we may say a player showed up when they finally make a good play. The kingdom has always existed, but it has shown up throughout history, with the final showing up in the first century through the first and second coming of Jesus. In one article, I said the kingdom of God is present. And you can go to my website and read that article as well. Okay, in the first article, we looked at the writings of Luke. One of the biggest takeaways from that article is that after mentioning the kingdom over 30 times, Jesus said that the kingdom of God would come at the fall of Jerusalem, Luke 21:31. Also, the kingdom would arrive at the resurrection of the just, or the righteous. So the resurrection of the just would happen at the fall of Jerusalem as well, Luke 14:12-14. Now, in that passage, Jesus talks about a grand banquet in response to a comment by someone at the table. And the entire thing is based off Isaiah 25, which is one of Paul's primary sources for the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, this connection places the 1 Corinthians 15 resurrection at the fall of Jerusalem as well. Let me say that again for the people in the back. Luke 14:12-14 says that the resurrection of the just would happen at a great banquet, celebrating the arrival of the kingdom of God. This great banquet is sourced from Isaiah 25, which is also Paul's primary resurrection passage. in 1 Corinthians 15. Okay, the second order we looked at also connected the resurrection to the coming of the kingdom, specifically Abraham's resurrection. We already read this passage, but it's the one where he talked about many would come from the east and west and would sit with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So this means that Abraham needed to be resurrected. And this, of course, makes sense because the resurrection would happen at the end of the age, and which is the time that the saints would inherit the kingdom according to Matthew 13. And Jesus said the end of the age would come within that generation. Matthew 13, 36 to 43, where he quotes from Daniel 12, 2 and 3. And Matthew 24, 34 says that would happen within that generation. Now, Mark and Paul, they also see the kingdom as future to them. Okay? But while they put it off to the future, they also claim that it was coming before the death of some of the Christians living. For example, Mark 9:1, those standing here will not taste death, right? 1 Corinthians 15, 50 and 51, flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. But then he turns around and says, I tell you a mystery, we will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. Indicating that, just like Jesus said, there would be some alive at that resurrection. Okay, the last guy we looked at was John and Peter, and John places the coming of the kingdom at the judgment. Revelation 11, 15 through 18. Here's what I said about that yesterday. I said this first passage, Revelation 11, 15 through 18, places the coming of the kingdom at the sounding of the last trumpet. The judgment of the dead, the rewarding of the prophets, and the rewarding of the saints would all take place at that time. This would all happen at the fall of the city where Jesus was slain. Now, in fact, John places the entire book between two sets of passages which mention that the things within the book were at hand. With all of this evidence in mind, how could anyone see Pentecost as the fullness of the kingdom, as the kingdom coming with power? Now, while we should affirm that the kingdom was among the people at Pentecost, Jesus said that in Luke 17, the kingdom of God is among you. People were trying to violently enter into the kingdom of God. The church did not inherit the kingdom until the coming of Christ at the fall of Jerusalem. All right, folks. Hope you have a good day. Thanks for tuning into this series. I will see you tomorrow. God bless.